Hey Goulet fans, this is Brian Goulet here, gouletpens.com, with a quick troubleshooting video. Got a few questions on our site about changing out the nib on a Diplomat Aero. Now this principle works very similarly. I've done this if you look at the Goulet nib video, similar principle. This is a standard number 6 nib. Diplomat has it made by Yovo. Little quick disclaimer here just to get it out of the way. So Diplomat does not sell replacement nibs. They are not necessarily made to be user serviceable, user swappable. That's not how they advertise it. That's not how they warranty it. So this, put the full disclaimer here. This is a hack. This is something that you are doing of your own accord, and you're taking all the responsibilities, liabilities heretofore, etc., etc. Insert legal talk here. Now, that said, it's your pen, you can do what you want with it. So if you really want to swap this out with a different nib, by all means, that's up to you. So I'm going to show you how that's done so that if you are interested in doing it, you can do it safely. Okay, so it's a friction fit nib and feed inside the housing here. Now, other pens, like if you've seen videos where I've done, I don't know, say Edison pens or done some like Conklin Monteverde things, there are replaceable housings that come. And there are some manufacturers that sell whole nib units and you just screw in and out the nib unit. I know that's how it is with Conklin and Monteverde. Well, that's not really how Diplomat does it. The housing stays inside the pen. So if you're trying to swap it out, you really have to do it by pulling out the nib and the feed itself, and the Goulet nib that you might get, or any other number 6 nib, it's going to come, just in raw form like this. You're not getting the whole nib unit. So you really have to pull the whole thing out. I find it easier to pull the nib and feed out together and then set the nib and feed, the new one, back in together, rather than trying to just pull the nib out, because you're going to have to reset it to the feed anyway. So let me show you a little close up how I do it. Zoop. All right. So what I like to do is I like to grab right here. I kind of rest it in my index finger, and then I use my thumb to put pressure against the back of the feed. I find that this way gives me the most control. It allows me to kind of wrap my finger around. There's other people that do it the other way. That's totally fine. I just personally like to do it this way because I kind of wrap it around the round part, and then I can hold on to the flat part of the nib. Now, if you're not doing this on an Aero, if you're doing it on another style of pen, just be conscious that anytime you're touching the fins, they're plastic. They are somewhat fragile. So if you're really trying to rip and pull these things out, you could damage them. That's one of the ways that you can wreck your pen. So don't advise it. If you damage a feed or bend it a little bit, it's really not the end of the world because the ink's not flowing through here. It's really just meant for air control. Acts as kind of a regulator. But anyway, so just be conscious of that. And then what I also like to do is I like to grab with my, in this case, my left hand. Let me zoom out a bit. Might make it easier to see. So I'm grabbing the pen very firmly with my left hand, and then with my right hand, I'm grabbing the nib and the feed, okay? So in this instance, I have the two parts in my two different hands. The one mistake that I see a lot of people make is they try and pull it like this. Well, if you're trying to pull a part like this, the natural inclination when you're pulling is gonna be to pull and go like this, right? Because that's the way your arms kind of work. So if you're trying to pull like this, eventually you have less control. You're using your shoulders and your upper arm to pull, which is going to cause it not to be a very fine motor skill. And you're going to just jerk it and have just this sudden motion. And then you might do the snapping thing and you might break the post off the back of your feed. I personally have done that. So just letting you know, it's a risk. So what I like to do instead is hold it like this. So I'm kind of cradling the whole thing. And then as I'm pulling the nib and feed out, I like to just kind of press my right hand against my left hand, and I can just push it very gently. So I'm doing kind of this motion, right? So I'm keeping my fingers right here, my ring finger and my pinky especially, but even my middle finger. And then all I'm really doing is pushing with my fingers here. So here I'm using my fine muscles, which aren't as strong necessarily, but it gives me a lot more control than doing this yank apart motion, right? So as I'm trying to pull this apart, I'll zoom back in. Boop. I will very gently, I'm pressing together pretty firmly because I want to keep the nib and feed together, okay? And then I'm just very gently, whoop, see, it just kind of gave. Sometimes, and this is a factory fresh nib, I've never pulled this out. So this is, it's gonna be firmer the first time you do it than it will be every time they're on. But anyway, that's how it works. So you do that. Sometimes if you have to, you can rock it side to side a little bit. It gets a little risky doing that, but it's better than just like yanking the thing out of there and losing control. So I find that if you just gently kind of push it like that, there, pressing one hand off the other, and then all I've done is pull it out a few millimeters, and then that allows me to, it loosens up as I start to pull it out, and then I can pull it out in a much more controlled manner. So that's the feed post I was talking about. If you're pulling it out in this motion, you can catch this thing on here, and you can knock that post right off. The pen will still work. It's just ideally you don't want to do that. Okay, so there we go. So now if we're looking at how this thing is actually assembled, so this is your feed. This looks very similar to a lot of other feeds. This is a, I don't know technically if this is the same feed that's used on all other Yovo nibs. I think a lot of times feeds and housings may be sourced separately from just the nibs, but either way, it's the feed that matches up to a number 6 Yovo, so should look fairly familiar to a lot of you if you've ever taken apart your pens. It does fit into the pen in this very specific way. So it's got this contour so that the flat part of the feed at the bottom here, has to fit in a certain way, but we'll get to that when I talk about putting it back together. The way this thing works, so the feed post right here, that is what goes to your ink chamber, whether it's a cartridge, converter, in the case of this Aero. It has this feed channel right here, or the ink channel. So by capillary action, the ink flows down here, comes all the way up to the tip, and then it mates up to the back of the nib, or the underside of the nib. And then that small slit in the nib, that's where the ink travels, and you're in pretty good shape from there on out. Okay. Now Diplomat, they don't have a breather hole in their nib. It doesn't really need it, honestly. Most of the reason why there's a breather hole, that little hole right there, is actually aesthetic. I mean, to a small degree, it might help with airflow, but most of the time, it just gives a firm stopping point for when they're cutting the slit into the nib. It just gives them a place to shoot for and lets them know where to stop. But it's not super necessary, and Diplomat doesn't have it on theirs. So there you go, in case you ever wondered why you see it on some pens and not others. But anyway, so you'll have your nib and your feed kind of set in here like this. And basically, as soon as you pull it out, it's like free to roam. I find it's best to clean the pen first before you take it apart, but you don't have to. You can swap inky nibs if you want to. You're going to get ink on your fingers like I have here, but that's okay. And then I have my other nib that I'm going to replace it with, right? So I'm replacing, this, what is this, a medium? It's a medium nib? Yeah. And I've got an extra fine. So yes, I would like to put an extra fine on here, and it should replace rather similarly. Okay, so whether you are putting it back with a Goulet nib or you're putting the Diplomat back, you can still use the same principle. So basically you want your positioning to be right about here, okay? So if it's too far like this, that looks a little weird. Looks like it's got, its pants up around its shoulders. That's not necessary. If it's like this, it's too low. The ink's not going to get far enough to mate up to it. So it's going to go roughly right here. But honestly, the way that these housings work, it's pretty much going to go down into a defined position. So in this particular pen, you're okay. So hold it back in your hand just like you had it before. You're going to match it up, close to where it needs to be. You don't want to touch the tip and twist and do all that kind of stuff. You can cause your nib to go out of alignment. So this is what I was talking about a second ago. So this is if you have your housing, it's not just a perfectly round circle. It's very subtle, but it has this little indentation. So you can see right here, it's got a flat part of the bottom for the flat part of the feed, if I can catch the light right. See how the feed's flat on the bottom there? Well, that's going to match up to there. And then here at the top, it's got a little room for the nib. It's not much room, but it's there. But if you don't put it in that correct orientation, you're going to have problems. You're going to get it stuck. It's not going to want to go all the way in. You could damage your feed. You could damage your nib. It's not going to be great. So you can kind of gently start to put it in in the wrong way, but you're going to quickly realize like, oh, this is getting stuck. Like before I even get the nib in place, it's getting stuck. And you're like, what is wrong? Well, you don't have it set right. When you have it set in the proper position, it's going to start to go in just a lot more naturally. And it's going to go in, well, because that's how it's made to go in. And it'll drop in like without a huge amount of force. You'll be able to get it until, it's almost in position right here. It's not final set position, but my feed kind of dropped all the way down to the bottom. And my nib is not down quite all the way. If that happens, I just kind of take and push the wings down. I don't want to pinch them too hard. I don't want to do anything crazy with the top there, but I just kind of put a little bit of pressure right on the wings of the nib, and I just kind of slide it down into place right there. And it'll stop pretty positively right about there. I want to make sure that it's not like too twisted or that the feed is like misaligned from the nib. But honestly, the way this housing is, once you get it seated all the way down in there, it pretty much sets it in place. You know, and then basically I'm just looking to make sure that the tines are not all whacked out, that I didn't bend it in the process, that, you know, the feed is not somehow misshapen, or that the nib wasn't bent that I'm trying to replace it with. You know, I want to make sure that if the feed is pushing up too far on the nib, then I'll have a huge gap, you know, in the tines like that. That's not great. You know, you don't want the feed putting pressure on the nib. So you want it to be right about, well, where it should be. You should see a tiny little bit of light through there. That's your ideal scenario. Now, if you have something other than this, now you're getting into like whole like nib troubleshooting, and that's beyond the scope of this video. But there you go. This is now a Goulet number 6 nib replaced in a Diplomat Aero. And that's basically the whole process, folks. This pen is basically ready to ink up and go. Anytime you replace a new nib, I recommend just giving it a quick cleaning. You know, I think that's always a good route to go, but hopefully this is helpful to you if you're replacing a nib on an Aero or basically any other pen that has a number 6 nib. This is how it's done. Anyway, thanks folks. Appreciate it. Let me know if you have any comments, and if you have any troubleshooting stuff, questions about pens, you can reach out to my team at gouletpens.com. Thanks everyone. Later.